Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and today I want to pose one question for every single NBA franchise going into the 2024 NBA season. These questions cover a variety of topics like how is this new addition going to work, how are they going to figure out this position group, how do they operate on defense, offense, everything in between. Like I said, I'm talking about every single team. We're going to go from the Atlanta Hawks alphabetically down to the Washington Wizards. Should be timestamps on the video as well for you to find your favorite team. And yeah, should be a fun one. I've been enjoying making these every team videos, getting a chance to talk about each and every single squad. Comment down below letting me know the answer to your favorite team's question that I pose, or drop one of your own down below and I'll try to respond to as many as I can. Also, as usual, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos, and let's go ahead and get into the questions. First up, we have the Atlanta Hawks, and my question for them is, will they be able to add a third star? The rumor is the Hawks want a third guy next to Trae Young and DeJounte Murray on that roster, a third all-star caliber player, and the guy that's mainly been rumored is Pascal Siakam, and I could definitely see a world where Siakam lands in Atlanta. You know, they have a good trade package, the Hawks do, with AJ Griffin, DeAndre Hunter, Clint Capella could be a salary guy. They also have Onyeka Okongwu as another young piece to throw in there if they'd rather keep AJ Griffin. Regardless of what the package actually looks like, I think they're the most realistic destination right now for a Pascal Siakam trade. Now, the problem is he reportedly doesn't want to, at the moment, extend with any teams that trade for him. Maybe he re-signs in the offseason after testing free agency, but that's certainly a risk. So maybe it isn't Siakam, maybe it's somebody else. But really, I'm just wondering if they're going to be able to actually pull off that third star trade to push them towards championship contention, or if they're going to stand pat with what they have now, see if the young guys develop, and try to make a play this season that way. For the Boston Celtics, my question is, can their front court actually stay healthy? As I've said a bunch of times on this channel, I'm a big believer in what Boston has building over there. I think the Kristaps Porzingis addition helps answer a lot of the problems that they had in the past couple years with offensive issues. It gives them a third star next to Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. I like the move a lot, but the big concern is, how are they actually going to be able to stay on the court? KP has been pretty injury prone over the course of his career. Same thing with Robert Williams, and those two guys are going to be integral to their success. Al Horford is also getting older. He might need to load manage or deal with some injuries of his own. So if they deal with some problems in the front court actually keeping guys on the court, this Celtics team could take a decent step back. If they can stay healthy, this front court has the potential to be one of the best in the NBA, but that's certainly not a guarantee when you take a look at the history of these guys. For the Brooklyn Nets, my question is, how do they consistently generate offense? Defensively, I'm not really worried about this team. I think they're going to be pretty stacked on that end. They've got Ben Simmons, who I think could bounce back to be a pretty good defender this season. Mikal Bridges, who has consistently been a great defender over the course of his career. You've got Nick Claxton down low. Dorian Finney-Smith's a good defender. You also have Royce O'Neal, who can hold his own. Cam Johnson can. Overall, defensively, I think this team really isn't going to have any problems. But offensively, that's a whole nother thing. Mikal Bridges showed that he can be a pretty reliable one option last season, but that was only half the year. We don't know what he's going to look like over a full season, especially now that teams know that they've got to really keep an eye on him. Maybe Cam Johnson jumps up to over 20 points per game, but that's speculation. And a lot of the other scorers across the roster aren't great at self-creating, or it's somewhat inconsistent. So I do worry about the offense with this team. Defensively, again, I think they're going to be great, but I'm curious to see how they actually manage to put points up on the board to match that great defense. For the Hornets, my question is, how are they going to prioritize Brandon Miller? They just took him with the second overall pick, and in my opinion, he has the potential to be the second star for this team next to LaMelo Ball down the line. But they've got a weird roster over there. They still have Gordon Hayward, a veteran wing. Miles Bridges is now back after his year-long suspension. You've got PJ Washington, who may or may not be back over there. You have other guys who are going to take shots like Terry Rozier, LaMelo Ball. It's a weird team, and the Hornets also have a history of not really prioritizing their young guys. Now, this could be different because Brandon Miller was just a second overall pick, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that they start him and give him a lot of opportunities, but I'm a little bit worried that Gordon Hayward's going to start over him. He's not going to get as many shots because of a bunch of guys on this roster. In my opinion, they should trade Terry Rozier, trade Gordon Hayward, go all in on this youth movement, let Brandon Miller start, and get a bunch of opportunities, but I'm afraid that that may not be the case, at least for the beginning of the season. For the Chicago Bulls, the question remains, how long do you let this thing ride? Are you going to go up until the trade deadline? Are you going to go to the first month of the season? Are you going to go all the way to the end of the year and export in the offseason? How long do the Bulls go before blowing this thing up? It does feel inevitable that they'll do so at some point, but the moves that they made in this offseason signals to me that they're at least going to give it a go for the beginning of the season. Now, by the deadline, I think they've got to make a hard decision. Do you try and buy more and go all in on this team, which I think would be a terrible decision, or do you finally go ahead and blow it up? Mainly because DeMar DeRozan is a free agent heading into this offseason, and you really can't risk losing him for nothing when you probably could have traded him for a decent haul this past offseason, the offseason before, or even at the trade deadline. So I think they've got from now until whenever the deadline is, it's usually like February-ish, to make that decision, and I'm curious to see where they land on that timeline before they eventually realize what the rest of us have. This isn't going to work. For the Cavaliers, the question is who fits at that small forward spot? We know Darius Garland's the 1, Donovan Mitchell's the 2, Mobley's the 4, and Jarrett Allen is the 5 going into this season. Now that could change eventually because apparently they're not super sold on the big duo of Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley. Maybe they'll move Mobley to the 5 eventually, but for right now, we know those 4 are going to be in the starting lineup. Who is the answer at that 3 spot is a completely other problem. Isaac Okoro has been their attempt to answer that question, but he's been inconsistent on both ends. He shows some great flashes defensively, but then struggles off ball. He knocks down some shots sometimes, but can't really do much else offensively, and even that three-point shot isn't as consistent as you would like it to be. They brought in Georges Niang and Max Strus, who could both theoretically play some minutes at that spot, although Niang is pretty slow-footed and isn't exactly going to keep up with many of the threes out there. He's a lot more of a 4, and also Max Strus is a bit smaller. He's 6'5", and already having Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell in that backcourt, you probably don't want another small guy out there at the 3 spot. So I don't really know. There's also like Karis LeVert. They could try Jetty Osman. They could try a number of guys, but nobody feels perfect at that spot. Maybe eventually someone will establish themselves as that perfect fit, but for right now, that remains a question mark. For the Mavericks, my question is, are their current bigs enough? They've got a lot of talent across this roster. Luka, Kyrie, Josh Green. They added Grant Williams, who I like, Maxi Kleba. They have Jaden Hardy off the bench, Seth Curry, a bunch of other guys. This team is really talented, but the big position is continuously a question mark for them. They've got some decent guys like Dwight Powell, but I think he's more of a bench big. Rashawn Holmes was not very good in Sacramento. Maybe he fits better here in Dallas, but I'm still not super high on him. Derek Lively, I like a lot for the future, but I don't know if he's going to make a championship level impact like they want him to from day one. JaVale McGee they brought in, and he just was not good in his first season as a Maverick. So they've got some guys who seem promising, but I don't love any of their options in the moment. To me, it still feels like they need that center trade to really solidify this team as one of the best in the West. I don't know if they try to make another addition in the summer, if they wait to see how it works in the season before trying something, if they wait up until the deadline. I don't really know, but I'm not completely sold, and I do think right now their big situation is their biggest weakness. For the defending champ Denver Nuggets, my question is, will their youth off the bench be able to step up enough? In the starting 5, they've got a pretty solidified group with Jamal Murray, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Michael Porter Jr., Aaron Gordon, and Nikola Jokic. It's probably the best starting 5 in the entire league. But beyond that, there's a bit of uncertainty, especially after losing Bruce Brown and Jeff Green in this offseason. They're going to need a lot of production from young guys who really haven't been in those roles before. Now, one young guy who is already kind of established in this rotation and showed a lot was Christian Brown in their championship run. He was big, but other guys like Peyton Watson, for example, Zeke Naji, Jalen Pickett, new rookie that they brought in, Hunter Tyson, Julian Strother, young guys like that will likely be called upon in this rotation to play some minutes in potentially some big-time scenarios. Now, thankfully, they've got a bunch of young guys that they can cycle through and find who works the best, but none of these guys are incredibly established, so there's a chance that if they don't step up and don't perform to the level of those other role players they had, the Nuggets could falter a little bit. Now, I do trust their development and think ultimately they'll be fine, but it is certainly something to keep an eye on. For the Pistons, the question is, how do Jaden Ivey and Cade Cunningham fit together as a backcourt? This is something I talked about a good bit in my full Pistons video. If you want to hear more about them, make sure to go check that out. But I think that this is the core of what the Pistons need to evaluate over this year and the coming seasons. They project as 2 of the best guys on this roster. Cade, of course, is seen as their franchise guy, being the #1 overall pick a few years ago, and they just took Jaden Ivey, who had a great rookie season. There are some concerns with the lack of shooting between the two, among some other things, but I think long-term they'll be fine, and this year in particular is a great chance for them to gauge how these two guys are going to operate together, and more importantly, what other talent do they need to put next to them to best optimize their skill sets. For the Warriors, I think the question on everyone's mind is, was the Chris Paul acquisition worth it? Bringing in CP3 was something that nobody expected from Golden State in this offseason. He gives them a really good ball handler and playmaker off the bench, which I think could be huge for some of those second units, and overall, I think he's going to be a good addition. But he did come at the cost of one of their best young players in Jordan Poole. looking towards this season, if Chris Paul doesn't work out, if he's injury prone, if the Warriors falter, that move may be looked back on as a massive mistake. Also, if Jordan Poole balls out in Washington, we'll talk about him a bit later when we get to the Wizards. So this season in particular is going to be really fascinating to see how Chris Paul works with this team and if that trade was actually worth it. For the Rockets, the question is, and this one is also in the coming years, who becomes their franchise guy? They've got a number of players on this team that I think could be their number one down the line. Jalen Green is the number one option because he was taken a few years ago with the second overall pick and has already averaged over 20 points per game as a young player and feels really like he could be one of the top scorers in the league consistently down the line. Jabari Smith Jr. they also just took in the top 3 last year. He had a rough rookie season but showed a lot of flashes over the course of the year and in summer league, and I think he still has a lot in the tank. Alperen Şengün is another popular pick to be the best player on this team as a really fun playmaking big that many people are likening to maybe a Jokic type guy down the line. Now, I don't think he's going to become Jokic, who is one of the greatest centers of all time, but maybe you can utilize him in a similar way, running your offense through him. So there are quite a few guys who I think could be the best player in this team down the line, maybe even Amin Thompson, and this year it's going to be fun to evaluate that, see how those players play off of each other, who takes a leap, especially now that they have more talent on the roster with Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks, amongst others. They've got a better coach now in Ime Udoka. This season, I think, is going to be one that's really telling about who is the future alpha of this squad, and I'm really curious to see who it is. For the Pacers, their question is, who is the power forward going forward? They've got two main options in my eyes. It's Jarris Walker and it's Obi Toppin. I've said multiple times on this channel, I think Obi Toppin is a prime breakout candidate for this year. If they give him a lot of opportunities, give him that starting spot, he could really thrive. But if he falters a bit or if the defense is rough, maybe they instead sub in Jarris Walker, who was also a player that I'm really excited about for this upcoming season. He was one of my favorite prospects in the entire draft, a great defender. I think he's got more of an offensive game than he showed at Houston at times and could fit really well with the other young talent on that roster. So I think over the course of the year, it's going to be a battle between those two guys to see who maybe ends up being the 4 of the future alongside Tyrese, Benedict Mathurin, Miles Turner, and whoever else in that starting lineup. For the Clippers, my question is, how do you balance load management as well as team chemistry? This is a point I talked about a lot in my Clippers video. Make sure to go check that out if you want a full breakdown of the team. But pretty much, Kawhi Leonard and Paul George should probably load manage. It's no secret that they're both injury prone, and so playing them less if you can during the regular season, I think is probably important. But at the same time, last year, while those two were load managing and also just dealing with injuries in general, it felt like the Clippers really failed to establish any type of identity. They were super inconsistent on both sides of the ball. They were kind of middle of the pack offensively and defensively. They just didn't have a calling card. And I think a big part of that was because those two guys weren't consistently on the court and they weren't figuring out how to play with the role players. The role players didn't know how to play with them. The lineups were all over the place. You need your stars in the lineup to establish some kind of identity for your team. So how do you balance the load management but also build that team identity and just try and find someone to get Kawhi and Paul George both healthy for the playoffs while also having your team ready to go? For the Lakers, my question is, who is going to close games for this team? I think there's a lot of different ways they could go. Of course, LeBron James and Anthony Davis will be out there, as well as likely Austin Reeves, but those other two spots are up for grabs. If they need some defense, it's likely Jared Vanderbilt. If they want more offense, it's probably Rui Hachimura. And at the point guard spot, if they're looking for defense, they probably go Gabe Vincent. If they want more three-point shooting, they go D'Lo and some playmaking. There's a couple different ways they could go. I think that starting point guard spot between Gabe Vincent and D'Lo could also be somewhat contested throughout the season. Of course, D'Lo is probably the better player, and I think he will and should get a majority of those starts. But if they're looking for a better defensive matchup, maybe they go Gabe Vincent. D'Lo really struggled on that end throughout the playoffs. I don't know. It's pretty interesting. The Lakers have a lot of talent, and I think there's a bunch of different ways they could play things. For the Grizzlies, my question is, will the Ja Morant suspension sink their season? He's going to miss the first 25 games of the year due to that suspension because of the stuff he did in the offseason, and that's a lot of time. That's over a quarter of the year. Now, the Grizzlies have been pretty good the past few years when Ja Morant has missed time, but not only now are they going to be missing Ja Morant, but they're also going to be incorporating Marcus Smart into things, who is a good player and I think will fit in pretty seamlessly eventually, but I could see some growing pains. They also have to figure out their 3 spot still, where they're relying probably on a lot of young players, but Dylan Brooks is gone, so they're going to be losing some of that defensive identity and one of the team leaders. I don't know. I think the Grizzlies could really struggle out of the gate without Ja Morant to begin things, and even when Ja comes back, you now, midway through the season, have to integrate this star caliber point guard alongside Marcus Smart, who's new to the team. I think that Ja Morant suspension could be a bigger disaster than people are realizing for their season, and ultimately, it could push them pretty far down the standings. Now, when fully healthy and with Ja in the lineup, I think the Grizzlies are one of the best in the West, but at least for the beginning of the season, it's going to be rough, and that could ultimately prevent them from getting an ideal matchup in the playoffs that could sink their year altogether. For the Heat, my question is, what is their Damian Lillard backup plan? Right now, they're of course the favorites to land him, and I think they eventually will, but say that they don't. Either he doesn't get traded there, he goes somewhere else, or the Blazers say, no, we're not going to trade him right now, we're just going to hold on to him going into the season, and the Heat suddenly have to begin the year without the star point guard that they've been looking for. What happens? Do they try and angle to trade for a different star, especially if Dame gets dealt somewhere else? Do they just try and run it forward with this roster, which is good, but I think they're going to take a step back because now they're missing Max Strus, they lost Gabe Vincent, Tyler Hero is probably somewhat alienated because he's been at the center of all these trade talks. What happens? I think this Heat roster with Dame is one of the best in the East, and I still think they're good even if they don't get him, but if they don't, there are certainly some major concerns with this team. For the Bucks, my question is running it back going to be enough? Last year, they lost in embarrassing fashion to the Heat in that first round. Now, I do think they still were a championship contending team. They did lose Giannis, and maybe if Giannis is healthy, things look differently, but those are all what ifs. We can't look on that. Instead, we've got to look at the result, and they lost in the first round. They should have been able to overcome that Giannis injury, and eventually he did come back, but it still wasn't enough. Going into this year, they really didn't change that much. They changed their head coach. They've now got Adrian Griffin instead of Mike Budenholzer, and they brought in like Malik Beasley, but they lost Javon Carter and really didn't do much else outside of that. So my question is that going to be enough for them to go from first round exits to championship contenders? I still think they've got a championship contending core, but it does worry me a little bit the fact that they fell so easily in that first round. Maybe they're completely fine and that last year was a fluke, or maybe they're setting themselves up for disappointment again. For the Timberwolves, my question is, can Rudy Gobert and Cat coexist together? It's the same question I had going into last season, but we didn't get to see them play much alongside each other over the course of this year. Cat, of course, missed most of the year. He missed from like Black Friday till, March, April. He didn't play very much whatsoever, dealing with an injury. So they looked good at times. When they played together, they looked bad, but they never got a full season to establish chemistry and really say, hey, we either can or cannot do this. This upcoming season is going to say a lot about this duo, and I think it's going to show the Timberwolves the moves they have to make going forward, whether they have to trade one of these two guys or if they can continue to try and build around them alongside Edwards and Jaden McDaniels. For the Pels, the question is, as always, will we actually see Zion and Brandon Ingram on the court together this year? It feels like we never see these two guys play alongside each other. Last year at the beginning of the year, the Pelicans were one of the best teams in the West, and they dealt with injuries to both Zion and Ingram amongst others, and suddenly they fell down the standings and they missed the playoffs, losing to the Thunder in the play-in tournament, where Zion again did not play. Are we actually going to see these two guys play? When they do play, they seem like an unstoppable duo, and the Pelicans look like one of the best in the West, but that's very inconsistent. And if they again have a season where they can't keep these two guys on the court, do they start to consider trading one or both of them? For the Knicks, my question is, can RJ Barrett be the third star on this team? They've got Jalen Brunson, who's an all-star caliber guard, Julius Randle, who struggled in the playoffs, but at least in the regular season has been an all-NBA player. And then there's RJ Barrett, who they're paying a max contract at the moment, and they're still looking for him to take that step forward. I don't know if it's ever coming where he becomes an all-star or at least a fringe all-star caliber player, but if he does take that leap, that would be huge for this Knicks team. If he doesn't again this upcoming year, and maybe a star player becomes available around the deadline, perhaps the Knicks pull the trigger, trading a bunch of those picks that they have alongside RJ Barrett and maybe some other young talent to bring in an actual third star for this team to help elevate them forward in the top tiers of the Eastern Conference. This is a big year for RJ, in my opinion. He's either going to say, hey, I'm this third star and I'm an important part of the future, or he's going to say, hey, you should probably include me in a superstar trade package when that comes around. For the Thunder, my question is, who's going to be the number 2 guy in this team going forward? We of course know that Shea is the number 1. He's an all-NBA guard. He just scored 30 points per game. It's pretty clear that he's the franchise cornerstone. But beyond him, who's going to be the second best player? There's Josh Giddey, who is shown to be that guy pretty consistently over the past couple of seasons. There's Jalen Williams, who is amazing as a rookie. Maybe he takes a sophomore leap. There's Chet Holmgren, who could be an incredible defensive anchor from day one and providing some spacing on that team. I think there are so many options to be the squad's second best player this upcoming year. Shea's the obvious number 1, but that 2 spot is up for grabs. For the Magic, the question is, who is the backcourt of the future? They've got 4 pretty interesting guards over there that are probably this season going to be fighting to establish themselves as the guys going forward. They've got Anthony Black, who they just drafted with the 6th overall pick. They've got Cole Anthony, they've got Markelle Fultz, and they've got Jalen Suggs, who they drafted a few years ago. All those guys have differing skill sets, some really impressive parts, some parts that are a bit concerning. It's a really intriguing group of young guards. this season they're going to have to give them a bunch of different looks, try these guys with a bunch of different lineups to see who is going to be the guys going forward. I think Anthony Black is probably pretty safe as one of those guys because they just took him, and I do think he projects as a great fit with the rest of this roster. But beyond him, I'm really not sure. If I had to pick someone, it's probably Markelle Fultz to be that other guard, but he also can't shoot very well, which is a problem with the rest of this team, including Anthony Black. So they've got a lot to figure out with that grouping. I'm really curious to see how that shakes out, who they start at what points, and ultimately who ends up joining Paolo, Franz, and Wendell Carter Jr. as the starting five of the future. For the Sixers, my question is, will Tyrese Maxey be able to take that next step? This is both with or without James Harden. Without him, they're going to need it more, of course, because then they just have Maxey as their lead guard. But even with Harden, Maxey is the swing factor. The Sixers have consistently been a championship contender that can't get over that second round hump, but having a young star in Maxey who could someday be an all-star guard is a big, bright light going towards the future. If Maxey becomes that all-star, he establishes himself alongside Embiid as one of the best guard big duos in the league, then that's huge for you, and you have two guys you can build with going forward. If you just find a third star, you're golden. But if Maxey never quite reaches that level, that's somewhat of a concern. This is a big year for Maxey to maybe take that leap, especially if Harden leaves, and I'm curious to see what he does. For the Suns, my question is, who does a majority of the playmaking duties? Bradley Beal is going to play the point guard, but I think Devin Booker is the better playmaker. Kevin Durant has also shown some chops. So I'm curious to see how they operate this thing. They really don't have a true playmaking point guard like they have the last few years with Chris Paul. Instead, it seems like it's going to be almost a playmaking by committee type of situation with Phoenix. I'm curious to see how it works and how that offense looks with that setup. With the Portland Trail Blazers, my question is, will they be able to deal Jeremy Grant? It seems like they're probably going to trade Damian Lillard at some point. They've got this young core of Shaedon Sharpe, Anthony Simons, and Scoot Henderson. But Jeremy Grant still feels like the odd man out, as well as Yusuf Nurkic. He's involved in this too. But Jeremy Grant in particular, because they just signed him to a massive $160 million deal that has him here for the next 5 years. It feels natural that they'd probably look to move on from him at some point soon, but that contract is pretty big, and I guess he wouldn't be a bad veteran player to have alongside the young guys on this team. Eventually, they'll probably trade him, but I'm just wondering if they'll actually be able to do it this season with the big-time contract, or if it'll take, at least an off-season or two to actually make the deal movable. For the Sacramento Kings, the question is, can they up the defense? The offense, I think, again, will be ridiculous with Sabonis, with Fox, with Huerter, with Monk, Harrison Barnes. That is a loaded offensive team, but the defense was a big problem all regular season, and in the playoffs, they also had some struggles too. Now, they did take the Golden State Warriors to 7 games, but this Kings team wants to be a championship contender, and to do that, they've got to figure out how to play defense more consistently. Does it take a trade? Is it a scheme issue that they can figure out? They've got to fix this defense, and if they can somehow shore it up and make themselves at least a solid defensive team, they'll be amongst the best in the West again. For the Spurs, my question is, what does Devin Vassell look like in a full season? Vassell was amazing in the time he played last year. He showed so many flashes of being a star-level scorer, the shot creation, the shot making, some really difficult looks on a team that really didn't have much talent around him whatsoever. I expect Devin Vassell to have a monster season this upcoming year if he's able to avoid injury, which is a bit of a concern. He had some injury issues last year, but if Devin Vassell stays fully healthy, keep an eye on him as one of the biggest breakout candidates for this upcoming year and a future star on the Spurs team alongside Vic. For the Raptors, my question is, are they going to be able to get value for the stars on this team? To me, it feels pretty obvious that the Raptors are heading towards a rebuild and that they'll likely have to trade both OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam pretty soon. I think OG is less likely because he's still a bit younger, but I do think eventually both those guys will be dealt off this team, maybe even Jakob Poeltl in those trades as well. The question is, how do you get value for them, and what value are they actually going to be able to get? They've had problems with that recently. They let Fred VanVleet walk this offseason for nothing when they could have traded him at the deadline. They also let Kyle Lowry walk for pretty much nothing. They did get Precious Achiuwa from the Miami Heat in that sign-in trade, but overall, they didn't get a big-time haul when it was reported that they might have been able to do so at the deadline beforehand. You don't want a similar situation with Siakam and Anunoby. You've got to go ahead and find some value for them, whether it's at this year's deadline, throughout the season in general, or in the offseason. You have to find a way to get actual tangible assets for your two stars. Hopefully they're able to do so, because if they aren't, their rebuild is going to start a lot slower. For the Jazz, my question is, who starts in the front court alongside Lowry and Walker Kessler for a majority of the season? Those two guys are obviously going to be there. Lowry's an all-star, Walker Kessler is an elite rim protector, but who's that third guy? And I think there are a number of options. Ochai Agbaji played at the 3 a good bit this past season, and I thought he did a pretty good job. He's a young player that has shown a ton of flashes and provides some good spacing for the rest of the lineup. Otherwise, they could go with Taylor Hendricks, who they drafted with the 9th overall pick, and I think projects as a great fit alongside Walker Kessler and Lauri Markkanen, but that might involve Lauri moving to the 3 spot, which he's done before in Cleveland, but could be a bit wonky, and, do you really want to mess with what Lauri did this past year at the 4? Otherwise, they could also, if they, again, want to move Lauri to the 3, put John Collins out there. He was a shock acquisition for this team in this offseason. I was stunned that they were the ones out of everyone who traded for him, but I don't hate the idea of buying low on John Collins. They traded basically nothing for him. And if John Collins can turn it around, find some of what he did in his first 2 seasons as a Hawk with this team, he's a really good fit in that front court too. They've got a bunch of interesting options. I'm curious to see who fits there and who ends up being the full-time starter. And finally, for the Washington Wizards, my question is, who on this team is a franchise building block? This is the first year of them going towards this rebuild, and it's the first chance for all these guys to say, hey, I'm someone that has to be here when we go into this new era. Jordan Poole is, of course, a prime candidate to do so. I think he could have a breakout year and will probably shoot a ton. Maybe Kuzma stays as a veteran on this team for the long haul. You've got Bilal Coulibaly, who's now here with the 7th overall pick. I think he is a franchise cornerstone, but he's got a chance to prove that this season. You've got other players like Denny Avdija, Corey Kispert, Johnny Davis, who didn't have a great rookie season at all, but maybe he turns things around. It's a fun time in Washington where things are super uncertain, but the future looks bright, and this is a chance for all these young guys to say, hey, I've got to be a part of us when we're trying to compete for a championship in the next 5 years or so. So yeah, that's my question for every single NBA team this upcoming season. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of your team's question and what the answer to that is. Also, leave a like and subscribe if you did enjoy. Helps the channel out a ton. This is probably a longer video. I've seen some of y'all say that you like the longer videos. Some of you have said that you don't. So let me know what you think. I can shorten them if you want me to. Otherwise, I could keep dropping somewhat longer videos. It's been fun to do so in the off season. But yeah, as always, appreciate y'all watching. I'll see y'all later. Real one, say it back.